Um, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As my father mentioned, and I'm sure you can see in the bottom of my screen, my name is Seth Frumkin, and I am the president of Kipcon. We have a very exciting and relevant and hot topic for you this morning, which is structural evaluations, why they are needed, and why you should have one done. To give a slight introduction, who really needs no introduction. I'm sure most people on here know my father, of him, or have known him, as we just heard, from several people for the last 20 years. He was the president of Kipcon, and now has a new title as our founder, and is still involved in some projects, but very involved in giving webinars like this one and education in the industry due to his extensive knowledge of these topics and involvement, not just in Kipcon, but in the industry itself, and also in setting and helping push forward the legislation that has started in the beginning of last year, which I'm sure everyone on here knows about, regarding structural inspections and reserve studies. So that being said, I'll turn it over to my dad, and I'm sure everyone will gain a lot from what he has to say.
You know, it's funny, I have to say, Seth, I didn't even see your thing about introducing me. So we actually thought alike on this one.
So, not the first time.
So again, good morning, everyone.
People say we look alike too. So.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome today. I'm going to try and get this done in an hour or so, but there's usually a lot of questions. So feel free. The best thing to do is if you drop any questions into the chat, and Chelsea will be monitoring them, and she's not shy about interrupting me. And by the way, while I'm doing that, Chelsea heads up all marketing for Kipcon, and there's a few other people from Kipcon on the firm. Maybe either Chelsea or Seth, you may want to just introduce who else is here, just quickly, so we can get going. This is the Camaro. Even Brandon's here. Oh my goodness. So.
Sure, on my screen here, I can't see everyone, but I see Jody Smallwood, Brandon Femia, Jen LaGuardia, Mark Yanchuk, and
Karen as well, Karen Tomlinson.
Karen Tomlinson, who is on the road always. So I think she's in the car, working hard on all of our inspections. And
John Paul's on as well.
John Paul.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And we're not going to go around and let everybody else introduce yourself, because we're up to 54 people, and I'm going to jump right in now. As I mentioned, we did have 140 people signed up for this, and we do have one conference room. There's about 6 people there, so that adds to the total. And if I'm not mistaken, this class is approved for continuing education units.
Yeah.
So you guys just have to let Chelsea know when it's done that you would like to get a certificate so you can use for continuing education. Also, I have a PowerPoint presentation. When I went through the PowerPoint presentation, I've given something similar to this a few times. So I actually went through and tried to add some new things, because there's a lot of things going on. And I skip around a little, but I will tell you that I've been heavily involved in the legislation in the state of New Jersey regarding structural integrity. And with that said, if anybody is not from the state of New Jersey, if you wouldn't mind just putting in the chat room that, because this presentation is geared towards 99% in New Jersey legislation, but I was very involved in a few other states. And if there are other states, I can tell you what's going on there as we're going along. So if there's anybody not from New Jersey, please let me know, or I'm just going to, Pennsylvania, okay. You have no legislation, so that's easy. All right, Pennsylvania. If I'm not mistaken, there is a meeting with the legislators in Pennsylvania. It may have happened already with your Legislative Action Committee from CAI to talk about structural integrity, but there's no legislation in place yet for either structural integrity or reserves. But so you look, Virginia also, okay. All right, so I'm going to jump in to give you a little bit of my background. As Seth said, and let me just go to the slide presentation. I'm going to go to a PowerPoint, and everybody will get a copy of this after the presentation. So you don't really need to take notes. You can see it from beginning. All right, I just want to. All right, can everybody see the presentation now? I just want to make sure. Chelsea, you can see it?
Yeah, I see it, yeah.
Okay. So what I'm going to be talking about, structural evaluations, what they are and why you should have one done. And in New Jersey, the legislation also includes reserve funding. There's been a number of things just in the last few days that are happening with the reserve funding legislation in New Jersey that I've been very involved in, working with really two other people out of the chapter, myself, Ed San George from Integra Management, and Dave Ramsey, an attorney. And we actually have met with Senator Singleton a few times over the last few days because there's some things happening regarding that, which I've decided at the last minute to add to this presentation. You're going to be the first people that hear this. So I did add that for you also. But I'm primarily talking about structural evaluations. And just like the invite for the presentation talked about, I'm going to talk about what a structural evaluation is, what it should include, the various levels of the type of assessments that you have, and some examples of the reports. Now, when I get into this a little further, you'll see that why this happened, why this happened, I'll get into why it's important, but it's based on, there's a three-legged stool when it comes to safety of our communities. It's broken down to structural evaluations, reserve studies, as well as maintenance. Today's presentation deals primarily with structure. If there's any connection to the structural evaluation to the reserve study, I will touch on that also, and please feel free to ask questions. Now, this is one of the new little things I added. I don't know if you recognize that, but that's me standing there. But a little bit of my background, I'm past president of CAI National, past president of the Foundation for Community Association Research, which I'm also still on a committee with that. When Champlain Towers happened and the collapse took place a few years ago, CAI immediately put together a national task force to develop public policies on condominium safety. And I was one of the co-chairs of that, the only engineer actually who was one of the chairs. And we involved over 600 people from around the country in developing the public policy on condominium safety, which has been updated by CAI and I actually chaired it when it was updated. I could talk about that if you like. But when it comes to New Jersey legislation and legislation in most states that I know of, that I've been involved in, it's generally based on the CAI public policy on condominium safety. So it's a very important report, and we will send you copies of it, or you can download a copy from CAI National's website. But it's a pretty extensive document having to do with condominium safety. And again, it's the basis very much for the law in the state of New Jersey. When we put together the public policy on condominium safety, we all came to the conclusion that the reserve study standards needed to be updated to reflect structural integrity as well as maintenance. So the reserve study standards were updated to reflect that. I was one of the chairs of the committee that also updated the standards. If anybody would like a copy of those standards, we can send it to you. And again, you'll see in the legislation in New Jersey and every other state that I know of, when it talks about reserves and reserve funding, it refers to the CAI reserve study standards as the standard to be used. So there we talk about the reserve studies. As a result of that, I told you the third part of this stool was maintenance. In response also, CAI put together a best practices report on maintenance. And there were 3 or 4 of us from around the country, including me, who developed that best practices report. If anybody would like a copy of that, we could send that to you also. Or Chelsea, I'm assuming you're going to send everybody copies of all this stuff.
Yeah, I usually do.
As I mentioned before, when Senator Singleton wanted to put together legislation in the state of New Jersey in regards to all of this, he reached out to CAI because he wanted to use the national public policy as the basis for the law in New Jersey. So Senate Bill S-2760 by Senator Singleton is based on those standards with a few of those, that task force with a few minor changes. Also in Newcastle, Delaware, they put together legislation. They now have a law in place in regards to structural integrity, very similar to this. And even though I live in New Jersey, I was one of the co-chairs of that task force that developed the law in the state in Newcastle, Delaware. So as I'm going through this, don't be shy, ask any questions you have, and put them in the chat box. And I promise you, even if I don't know the answer, and for those of you who know me, I'd be happy to make up an answer. So if you have any questions, because there's usually a lot of questions on that stuff. And I actually see some things in the chat already, and Chelsea will interrupt me.
Yeah, wait 1 second, Mitch. You are previewing the next slide. Mark pointed out. Are you able to fix the presentation mode?
I'm sorry?
The screen is not showing the full size of the one you're on. It's showing the next one. So if you X out,
What do you see? You see the one that says first a quick survey?
and then we see the next slide for what we're going to talk about. Yeah,
How's that?
that is better. If you go back one, I think though.
Oh, I wonder why it's doing that.
Yeah, that's never happened.
Now okay. So let me go back a slide then. I thought I had it set up right because I have two screens going on here. All right, so the quick survey that I'm going to talk about, I really asked for it before already. And my main question was, is there anybody from outside of the state of New Jersey? And it looks like the answer to that question is there a number of people here from Pennsylvania, and there's people here from Virginia. So that was my quick survey. I just wanted to see what states are represented. And now what we're going to be talking about, as I mentioned, in New Jersey structural integrity law. This is actually the press release that was on the state's website when this was signed into effect in January 8th of last year. So it's been a while already. Right. So
Mitch, two things. We also have someone from Florida here. And then Jim wants to know, what is the compliance mechanism used by, someone else, sorry, used by the state, and when and how often will the state be asking for the reports completed by Kipcon?
I will get into that. I'll get into that. All right, so I'm trying to get this. So in terms of the scheduling the first inspection and the scheduling the periodic inspections, I will be talking about that as I go through this. This is why do we need this? Again, I mentioned that the starting point for totally revolutionizing our industry was the collapse of Champlain Towers. I'm sure everybody has seen this picture. I've actually had the opportunity to go to the site, and right now it's an empty field, and there's a memorial on one of the fences right on the side of the property that has a picture of everybody that passed away in this collapse. So, but this was the thing that has really changed our industry. It was the collapse of Champlain Towers. And these things have proven that there are critical problems going on structurally with buildings all over. For example, this is Sea Isle City in New Jersey, and this was last summer, I think it was, where a balcony collapsed. This is New York, where a parking garage collapsed, and actually New York put into place a law requiring inspections of parking garages, because if you've ever been in a parking garage in New York, don't look up in most of them, let's put it that way, but there's a law to inspect them now. Now, why do we need this? I wanted to show you that the United States Census Bureau has a bunch of data that you can get. Now, what I did is I went into the Census Bureau, and it can tell you, for example, in the state of New Jersey, which this is, the total number of occupied multifamily housing units. So I don't know if these are condos, but they're multifamily housing units that are owned. So they do not include apartments. This recently came out of that. And if you want the link to get to see this kind of information, there's a huge amount of data. But the point I wanted to make here is the percentages. And that if you look at when these buildings were built, 2020 and later, 0.35%, ages 6 to 25, almost 14%, ages 26 to 45, it's 22% of the multifamily housing in the state of New Jersey. Now look at this, when you get to buildings that are 47 to 65 years old, it's close to 26%. Over 66 to 85, it's 23%, and 86 plus is 16%. Now the point I'm trying to make, which is in the next slide, is that why do you need this? Because as buildings age, they age, they've been built right, but they age and they run into problems. This chart just shows that over time, there's potential failures and functional failure. And take a look at this chart as you go into the future, that as buildings age, the potential for failure increases significantly as buildings get older. So there's a huge need for this. There's no question about it. Even taking Champlain Towers out of the mix, there's a huge need for this type of legislation. As I mentioned, when this first happened, CAI developed this public policy paper. Then what they also did, I don't know if the reserve study standards, the community association maintenance, these are publications that we'll send to you. And then it resulted in, can you see this where this little share thing? And then it resulted in New Jersey legislation, which I'm talking about. So they're all connected to each other. But now we have to go to the beginning. And Chelsea, can you see this thing where it says you are sharing, screen sharing?
No, I don't see that. I just
Okay.
see the
All right.
thing you're
Yeah,
on.
you can see my pointer, right?
Yes.
All right. So it all comes down to the building structure. What is the building structure? It's what holds up the building. It's made of a combination of things. At the bottom, what holds up the whole building is the foundation. There are beams that go horizontally that holds up the floor and the roof. There's bracing. These diagonal little blue guys are bracing. And what that is to keep the building from blowing over if the wind blows. So picture the wind blowing from the side. This bracing takes the wind forces down into the ground, these horizontal forces, and into the foundation. And the columns are the vertical parts of the structure that hold up the floors, hold up the roof, and hold everything together and bring the forces down into the foundation. So that's what the building structure is. It's what holds up the building. In the legislation says that which buildings, because the big question always comes up is, does my building need to be covered and inspected based on this legislation? The legislation is based on buildings that have a primary load-bearing system, which is made up of certain material types. Now, this is the actual wording for the legislation, and it says that the primary means the assemblage of components within a building comprised of the beams, the columns, the bracing, that by being connected to each other, take all the forces like the weight of the building, the winds and things like that to the foundation. So that's what it looks like. So the primary load-bearing system, and I'm going to show you some pictures of what I really mean, what it means in real life, but it's the things that take the forces to the ground. One of the things by definition, I'm going to add a little asterisk, is here it says balcony. By definition, a balcony is not part of the primary load-bearing system. But based on the collapse of the balcony in Sea Isle City and the problems with balconies that are found everywhere, we were able to change the legislation to say that the primary load-bearing system does include the balcony. So if there are balconies, even by definition, it's not included. They are included based on legislation. The other thing you see down here is the podium deck, and I'll talk about what that is. But the podium deck is included also as part of the primary load-bearing system. So this is what, keep in mind the terminology, because this is right from the legislation and it's right from the standards, which I'll touch on as part of the presentation. Primary load-bearing system is a very important word. Now, what does it mean? This is a steel building, and what you see is the walls weren't put on the outside yet, but you're looking at the primary load-bearing system. You see the beams, the roof, what holds up the roof. You see this beam that holds up the floor. You see the columns in the corner and every 20 feet or something. And then you see the bracing, which is there for the wind load. So the key to a primary load-bearing system and why it's included and why this definition is because the primary load-bearing system of the structure is based on the concept that if any one part of it rusts away or falls out or is not there, there's a possibility for a partial or a total collapse of this building. So for example, if this piece of wind bracing right here was not there and the wind blows, this top part of the column and this section of the building can collapse because just one part of the primary of the structure is not there. Same thing with this column. Imagine what happens if this column is gone. This whole corner of the building will collapse. So if this column deteriorates over time and rusts away and loses its strength, there's a possibility that the corner of the building can collapse. And that's why when you're inspecting the primary load-bearing system, this is what you're looking for. Then there's the beam. If this beam is gone, then the floor will collapse and there's possible the roof can fall or different things can happen. But now the definition goes on further. I'm looking the other way because that's how I'm changing the slides now. It says that a covered building, a building that's included in the legislation that needs to be inspected, is a residential condo or co-op building that has a primary load-bearing system. Remember what I just said? That's comprised of concrete, masonry, steel, or a hybrid structure, including heavy timber and a building with a podium deck. Now, I'll show you what these all mean in a second, but the key point here is that the type of buildings that are inspected are those that have a primary load-bearing system made up of these materials. Now, there's always confusion about this, and for the person who's here from Florida, don't listen to me, but if you don't want to, but in Florida legislation, if I'm not mistaken, I'm pretty sure I'm correct, it says that the buildings that need to be inspected are 3 stories or higher. If you look at all the standards, which I'll show you, as well as logic, and if the person from Florida has anything to say, feel free to jump in. The logic is if you're made up of these type of materials and you have a primary load-bearing system and it rots away, the building can partially collapse or collapse. So everything I've seen in every standard is not based on the building height. It's based on the materials of construction. So keep that in mind. This is a steel building. This is what's included. This is what it looks like under construction. I showed you one a second ago. What are the common causes of deterioration of a steel building? It rusts away. These are pictures of actual pictures from projects we've looked at where look at this picture on the left. The steel beam has totally disappeared at the bottom where this in the middle part is called the web. These bottom horizontal pieces are called flanges. The connection between this web and this flange is what gives it its strength. If they're not connected, there's no strength. This is what it looks like on the right. And if you look into it, this is a parking garage. In many parking garages, a lot of parking garages, this steel is covered with this white material, which is fireproofing material. If you start seeing that this fireproofing material is turning orange, or you see moisture, that means the steel underneath is rusting away and you could have a problem. But this is a sign of deterioration. The common cause in steel is water. Now let's talk about a concrete building. This is what a concrete building looks like under construction. Again, concrete, water don't mix when you come to deterioration and structural problems. Keep in mind, for those of you who aren't aware, that when you look at a concrete beam such as this also, I think this is in a parking garage, these concrete beams and columns are concrete, and encased in the concrete is steel reinforcing, it's called. If that steel reinforcing in the concrete gets wet, what happens is you build up corrosion. As it corrodes, it expands. And as it expands, 2 things happen. It starts pushing on the concrete, which this is called spalling, where it pops out of the corners or wherever because it's rusting. And also the reinforcing steel loses its strength. So the beam itself is losing its strength. So a very common cause of deterioration of reinforced concrete is water. You'll see that that's the common cause of everything. So this is reinforced concrete. Now, a question comes up a lot is, what is a heavy timber construction? What does it mean? And I'll show you. This is an example of a heavy timber building where you look at these. The columns are wood. The beams are wood. I don't see any bracing in here, but this is called a heavy timber construction. Concept, again, is that if one piece of this falls apart or rots away, like I'll show you in the next picture, the entire building or a portion of the building can collapse. This is what wood looks like on the right when it gets wet and starts deteriorating. The picture on the left I had to add because this is a picture I took about 2 weeks ago. This is a 4 or 5 story building, and it's all steel and masonry and things like that. But right here in the middle, they have a wood column that goes from here all the way up to the top supporting the building. If you look closely at this wood is splitting. Water and expansion and contraction, and that wood column is splitting. This building has about 20 of these. Every one of them is doing this type of thing. You can't miss it. You can see it. I still left my business card, but this is a different part of the country. But this is just a picture I took a couple of weeks ago to show the types of deterioration in wood. Now let's talk about a podium deck. A podium deck, and on the left, you see an actual building. And what you see is on the bottom, it's reinforced concrete down here. And on the top, this is what's called stick framing, which I'll talk about in a second. So this is a podium deck. A podium deck is essentially when you have a deck like this, which is supporting something up above and taking all the forces, the weight, the wind load, and whatever out of this top structure and bringing it to the ground through the podium deck and the columns below it. So this is what's a podium deck kind of construction. This question, I've heard it, as a matter of fact, somebody at Kipcon asked me about it about a week ago, about there's a building that Kipcon was inspecting it. Is this a podium deck? But this is the concept behind it. On the right, you can see what it looks like, a little diagram, concrete on the bottom. A lot of times you'll see in here that this is a promenade deck with pavers and a waterproofing membrane and things like that, where you have benches and planters and people sit outside. And on top of the podium deck, a lot of times underneath you have a parking garage. And on top, you have a building that is being supported by the podium deck. So that's the basic concept of a podium deck. Where do you see this most? You see it a lot in, like I said, in maybe high-rise buildings. You see it a lot. You see it in different kinds, but the most prevalent thing would be in a high-rise building where you may have a parking garage. And what happens on the podium deck is on the left, the water comes in. It may be brought in by the car if it's an enclosed parking garage. It may be brought in by the car. It may have salts in it, but you start seeing corrosion of the reinforcing steel, and you see spalling of the concrete and deterioration from water. The center, very common problem that I've seen a lot of this. You have an expansion joint in a podium deck. The expansion joint is to allow the structure on both sides of it to expand and contract without pushing against each other. And it's a part of the design where you don't want to get cracking and structural problems, so you include an expansion joint. Expansion joints start out with some kind of sealant on top and maybe a little piece of plastic that goes across, goes the full length. And that's not part of the expansion joint function other than to keep water from going through. These expansion joints, closures, I'll call them, are a huge problem because they disappear and people don't replace them. What happens if you don't replace them? Look underneath. Underneath this expansion joint, in this case, there's a steel beam on both sides of this expansion joint holding up the podium deck, and the water comes through and just rusts away that steel and deteriorates. And just replacing a closure on an expansion joint may cost you $1,000. Replacing the steel and fixing it will cost you $1 million. So that's because of a failed expansion joint, but very critical when you have expansion joints to make sure that they stay sealed. Here's some other example. This is a driveway up to a condo, which is a podium deck with stick frame buildings on top, which I'll talk about in a second. There's a lot of expansion joints in that podium deck that the water's been getting through. They haven't fixed them over the years. Look what happens below. The concrete gets wet, starts cracking, losing its structural strength. And what do some people do? It's not uncommon. They'll put in gutters like this and downspouts. So when the water comes through, it doesn't drip on the cars, but you can see what's going on to the concrete behind it. You're starting to see rusting and structural problems. And I'll talk about this again in the end, but don't put gutters and downspouts in underneath podium decks to get the water away. Now the question always comes up.
Mitch, before we move into this, I don't know where the appropriate spot for this is, so I'm just going to throw it out. How does a post-tension cable system fit in?
Well, a post-tension cable system, the basic difference in that is that here you have reinforcing steel that is when you form the concrete, when you put the concrete, you pour the concrete into a mold or a form, the reinforcing steel is there. And you don't have to do anything, it just sits there. Post-tensioning means that you put in tubes and you put tensioning cables in, and you put tension in those cables after the concrete has been built. And by putting tension into the concrete, it's a different way of providing structural strength to the concrete. So it's similar because it has steel in it, but that steel is post-tensioning cable, not reinforcing steel. The other, I guess, thing about post-tensioning steel, a lot of times, or most times, it's encased in a tube. So it's inside a tube, which may protect it from moisture, but it's just a different type of structural concrete, which is post-tensioning. There's other types which call pre-tensioning, where you tension it before you install it, but it's just a different type of reinforced concrete structure. Was there anything else?
Yes, but it's about retaining walls, so I figure we can cover that at the end if we have time.
Okay, that's fine. Now, the big question that comes up to everybody is my building excluded? Everything I've shown you are included buildings. What's excluded? If you look at this picture, this is called, and by the way, this wording up here is what's excluded structure means. And forgetting about the wording for a second, the concept is that if you have something like this picture, which is called stick framed, and there's a few different ways it's called, but I'm using the term stick frame. What it means is it's made out of 2x4s, 2x6s, every 16 inches, every 12 inches, whatever the spacing is. Keep in mind, a primary load-bearing system means that if one piece of the structure rots away, a partial collapse of the building can take place. When you have structures like this, where it's stick framed and very repetitive structure, if one of these 2x4s vertical or the roof rots away, the building isn't going to collapse. You're not going to have a partial collapse. So this type of structure, which a lot of buildings that are out there in the association industry are not required to be included and not required to be inspected. So this is an excluded building. But now I'm going to show you something. I don't know if I have another slide about it, so I'm going to go back for a second. If you look at this right here on the left, you have a podium deck made out of reinforced concrete at the bottom. At the top, you have a stick framed building. When it comes to structural inspections and what's included, in this case, the bottom podium deck, concrete columns and everything underneath it are included and do need to be inspected. But what's sitting on top of the podium deck, this stick framed wood structure, does not have to be inspected. Now, why is it critical to inspect the bottom? Imagine if this one little column in the corner rotted away. This part of the podium deck would collapse and take this entire building with it. So podium decks are required to be inspected, but the stick frame above it are not. So that's a question that comes up a lot. All right, another term that to mention is, because I'm going to touch on it, is maintenance. Maintenance is absolutely important. And when it comes to legislation, I'll touch on it, but there's three types of maintenance. Preventive maintenance, which is proactive maintenance that you do to proactively make sure that your structure doesn't deteriorate and that things on your reserve study will last their full useful life. As of right now, and it's not changing, the legislation says that when you do a reserve study for a building, and you have to do reserve studies for every association, the legislation is very clear. The reserve study must include the cost of preventive maintenance. So that is in the legislation right now. That's new to reserve studies. Corrective maintenance, well, let me go, deferred maintenance at the bottom is when you don't do maintenance. You just deferred and you don't do it. Corrective maintenance is maintenance that you do because you're not doing preventive maintenance and things happen that you couldn't plan for. So if you're not doing preventive maintenance and you start having problems with the structure, you have to fix it. It's called corrective maintenance. Also, corrective maintenance is as the building ages, you may not be able to plan for certain things to happen. It's just happening because it's aging. And then you go in and you have to fix it. That's corrective maintenance. The reason why I put these here is, like I said, preventive maintenance needs to be included in the reserve study. That's side point. But the legislation says that if when you're doing a structural integrity inspection and the report includes anything having to do with corrective maintenance, something that has to be fixed, it's very clear that the cost of that corrective maintenance needs to be included in the reserve study. So, for example, Kipcon's doing a number of reserve studies and structural integrity inspections for the same building. So when they do the reserve study and the structural integrity, if the structural integrity reports says corrective maintenance needs to be done, that needs to be included in the reserve study. If your engineer is doing a reserve study for a building that had to have a structural integrity inspection done and somebody else did it, you need to give a copy of that structural integrity inspection to the firm doing the reserve study, because if there's anything in there that requires corrective maintenance, it needs to be added to the reserve study. So keep that in mind. That's the connection between maintenance and the legislation, both in terms of the reserves, both as well as the structural integrity. The legislation says that all reports need to be prepared in accordance with the protocol established by the American Society of Civil Engineers for the structural condition assessment of a covered building or similar protocol by another nationally recognized structural engineering organization. I've looked at just about every other organization. The one it comes down to that everybody does their studies on, I think, at least I know Kipcon does, is the American Society of Civil Engineers has two publications. The one to the left is a guideline for structural condition assessment of existing buildings. This was published in 1999, as you can see up in the corner, 1199. Just in the last year or so, ASCE issued essentially an update to this standard from 1999. It's called Structural Condition Assessment of Existing Buildings and Guideline. Now, this one from just recently is, like I said, essentially an update to the one from 1999, and the legislation requires that structural integrity reports need to be done in conformance with these standards. This is also mentioned, outlined in CAI's publication on condominium safety. We did not reinvent the wheel when we came up with a lot of this thing, because there are standards out there, and this is a very important standard in the industry, and that's what it's based on. Now, what's the process here? This is, you like this little picture? That's Mitch looking under a roof. But there's a process in this standard, and I just want to walk you through the process because the question comes up a lot. This process is included in both of these guides, and this is the process for doing it, because there's two different types of inspections and reports that are done as part of this legislation. You go through, and here's the process. You're planning for the assessment. In this case, we're planning for an assessment because legislation requires they have to do it. The first thing you do is a preliminary assessment. I'll tell you a little more detail what it means, but when you're getting a structural integrity inspection done by a firm like Kipcon, that's based on doing a preliminary assessment where you review all the available documentation, you go out, look at the site inspection, and you look at everything, and then you come up with, and you say to yourself, do we have sufficient information to determine if there's a structural problem or not? Let me give you an example. You go into that parking garage and you have steel beams. You look at the steel beams, they're covered with fireproofing. You can't see the steel, but you see that there are rust stains in that fireproofing. You don't have sufficient information to determine if there's a structural problem. So what you have to do is, if you don't have sufficient information, see the no down here? The next step is to do a detailed assessment, which you in this case, you may say to the owner, you have to take off that fireproofing from the steel so we can see what's going on underneath it. If you do have sufficient information, you go to here to the yes, the process is you go ahead and you put together the report. But in some cases, we don't have sufficient information, and the conclusions in the report is they have to do a detailed assessment. This is where the process comes from. And like I said, the initial report that you're getting, the proposals from firms like Kipcon, are based on doing a preliminary assessment, which is what those standards require. So what is a preliminary assessment? This comes directly from the standard. It consists of a brief walkthrough. Brief walkthrough means you look at everything that's any place in the building where you can see where the primary load-bearing system is, either directly, or you can see in certain areas through the common elements where it is in the walls. You do a walk through the structure facility to identify visually discernible conditions of distress. If you're looking directly at the structure, obviously you can see it, you're looking right at it. But if you see, like I talked about with the fireproofing, there's wet, or if you go into the building and you're walking up a stairwell and you know where the column is and you see that the sheetrock is covered with water, then it's a discernible condition of distress, damage, deterioration, or instability. It can be used as a standalone review protocol, or it can be used to help define a more comprehensive assessment. So comprehensive assessment is where you go to the next step into the detailed assessment. By the way, that's me again standing there for the preliminary assessment. Now, what happens? That's me again. If from the preliminary assessment, if you see something, then you go into the detailed assessment. And that's the extent of a more comprehensive assessment, and it varies what you need to be done. So, for example, I just did a couple of structural integrity inspections with the property manager. Like I said, I'm a consultant to Seth now, down in Princeton. I walked it with the manager. We really, and these are interesting podium type buildings. And there's 3 of them, but in a couple of certain areas, we did see water damage. And so in this case, we were able, as part of the preliminary evaluation, to pop some ceiling tiles and look what's going on behind it. So they don't need a detailed assessment, but a detailed assessment, if they were sheetrock ceilings, may involve pulling down the ceiling, or like I said, taking fireproofing off of beams in a parking garage. So that's a detailed assessment. Keep in mind that when you get reports from most engineers, that may just be opening up a can of worms, leading from a preliminary to a detailed assessment. So just keep that in mind. So when is the first inspection required? Remember, the legislation was passed January 8th of last year, if the building was constructed prior to the bill passage and it's 15 years or more since it was built, certificate of occupancy, then those buildings need to be inspected within 2 years. So if you have a building that's more than 15 years old, it has the type of primary load bearing system I talked about, and it's more than 15 years old, you're required by this legislation to have a structural integrity inspection done within 2 years of the legislation. So now it's less than a year. There's a lot of these going on right now. And there's a lot of findings that show that they should have been going on. If it's less than 15 years at the time of the legislation, once it turns 15 years old, it needs to have an integrity inspection done within 1 year. So if you're managing a building that was 13 years old, or let's say 10 years old, it didn't need to have it done, but as soon as it turns 15, it needs to have a structural integrity inspection done within a year. So this is the first inspection. If it was constructed after the bill passage, let's say the bill passed last year, but this building didn't open until last week. Essentially the same concept. When it turns 15 years old, it has to have a structural integrity inspection done, so you have plenty of time. Unless you see a problem, then it's within 60 days. If it's a conversion, and that means you've converted, let's say, an apartment complex into a condo, then it's the same time frames within the 15 years. Very interesting, because when we were originally working on this legislation, Senator Singleton, a very sharp guy, we all agreed that why are we doing this for just condos? The original bill was based on all residential construction, irrespective of whether it was an apartment or a condo. There was so much pushback by the apartment association that the portion having to do with rentals was taken out of the bill. And the idea was that if it's a rental, it's one owner. So the owner takes care of their property values, and they'll look at their building and make sure it's in good shape, as opposed to a condo where you have a board of directors and homeowners, and they may all vote not to do the inspection. They may not do it because they're not going to be living there forever. So right now, it's only for community associations, but if it's a conversion, then it becomes a condo. It needs to be done. Once the first inspection is done, legislation again is very clear. The report is required, which I'll talk about in a second, to say when the next inspection needs to be done based on the conditions that you find, but in no case can it be more than 5 years after the original inspection. So it's within 5 years or 60 days if you see observable deterioration. Let's see. All right, what are the reports required to include? On the right are the words where it says it, but it's the condition of the primary load bearing system, any required maintenance to maintain structural integrity, any required corrective maintenance, and when the next inspection is to be performed. Now you can kind of group in the required maintenance and the corrective maintenance together, but required maintenance, you may need to do something to protect something that's structural, but required corrective maintenance is when something's already become damaged. So these are the things that are required to be done in the reports. What's included in the report? I think this is one of the most important parts of the report. What is the rating system? So when we're going through and looking at a building, each thing you see, and I'll show you some examples, are rated by their condition, whether it's minor, which are visual observations and conditions, which are indicative of progressive deterioration, but required to be monitored on a regular basis. So that's a minor condition. Moderate means that that are indicative of rapid progressive deterioration, which will require short-term monitoring. So if you see something in our report, you do the inspection, that's a minor condition, the report would say, come back and look at that in 2 years. I'm just picking a number. Or moderate, it might say, come back and look at it in 6 months. Severe is, as you would expect, means something needs to be done immediately because there's possible inadequacy of the structure. But whether it's this rating system, if you look in the ASCE guidelines, it really doesn't give a specific rating system to use, but your reports should have a rating system from whoever you get them for that indicates what the conditions are. In the city of Philadelphia, they have certain requirements for facade inspections, and they give you a rating system. But the bottom line is, whoever's doing your report, it should be include a rating system to show you, what the condition is and what needs to be done. The report should include a description of the inspection process in written or graphical form. For example, this one is showing graphically and in writing how the building was inspected. For example, on the left is a parking garage. We actually walked in, went back and forth and looked at everything, and this is actually the process. In most cases, it's just given in words. It's not given in a diagram. Some places, depending on the complexity, will give it as a diagram, but it should be included in the report, a description either in writing or graphically of how the inspection is done. On the right-hand side, this case, this building had concrete balconies, which are part of the structural integrity inspection. We did actually a drone view. The drone went back and forth, and this is the process. But again, that could have been done in writing and not with a graphical presentation. Now, here's the going through the report. These are various conditions. In this case, it shows something with the concrete, and it shows the location, and it shows what the severity is, minor, and a little description. That's a minor. This one is moderate, same type of thing, location. And then this, as you can expect from this picture, this is a severe condition where it needed to be dealt with right away because of structural inadequacy, structural problems. You can see what's happening here, that the reinforcing steel in the concrete got wet, it rusted, it expanded, and it popped out the concrete. All right, the reports that are prepared are required to be provided to the municipal authorities by the engineer. So when this is done, when the report is done, it needs to be sent by the engineer, not by the board, to the municipal authorities, which is what Kipcon does with all the reports, and made available to residents on request in the community. So these are the specific words of what needs to be done with the report. Who does the report? Very clear. It has to be done in the direction of a licensed professional engineer. Now, keep in mind what it says here down, this is legislation. An engineer licensed by state was the same qualifications required of an engineer under contract with the enforcing agency. So it has to be the same type of licensed engineer that the enforcing agency would use to inspect. And just because somebody is a structural engineer, a licensed structural engineer, does not mean they have the experience to inspect an existing building. It's a totally different world. It's a totally different type of thing. So just because a structural engineer can design a new building does not mean they also know how to inspect an existing building. So make sure when you're hiring somebody that they have the qualifications to do that. One of the most critical parts of legislation to me, which really doesn't necessarily deal with how to do the inspections, is that in a lot of buildings, it says in the bylaws that in order to do a special assessment, there needs to be a vote of the membership. If I'm not mistaken, in Champlain Towers, there was they wanted to do a special assessment to fix it. There was a vote of the membership, and it might have been voted down. But the legislation in New Jersey and the public policy from CAI says if it's a safety issue, there does not have to be a vote of the membership in order to do work. As a manager, certain things to, I'm good on time. As a manager, some things to look at as you're walking around. Keep in mind, as a manager or board member, you do not generally have the expertise to understand what the impact of things you're seeing are, but a lot of things you see should tell you that we need to get somebody in here to look at it. Now, if you see something like this, what you're seeing this is two things. You're seeing a white salty material. That means water's going through the concrete and carrying the salts of the concrete with it. And you're putting salts, it's known as efflorescence, on the surface, which means that water's going through. The next step is that this water is going past the reinforcing steel, and the efflorescence is now turning into rust stains. If you see this, you should get somebody in here to take a look at it to see what's going on, because the structural engineer will be able to tell you if that rust, how much of an impact it's having on the structure. Here, if you see another thing, if you see signs of water, you need to stop it. In this case, we were seeing rusting in the wall and took it apart and found that the column underneath was rusted. Here, I talked about this before. If you should never put tarps in buildings underneath podium decks to keep water from getting on cars, because what you're missing is how the structure is rusting away. Here, this is an example of putting gutters and downspouts in a parking garage between joints. Look what's happening. You can see that the reinforcing steel is rusting away, and you're making it even worse because you're holding the water there. This is an interesting one where they put a tarp underneath where the reinforcing is rusting and the concrete's dropping, not to fix it, but just to keep the concrete from falling on cars. You can actually see what's going on behind it. Again, the tarps to redirect water. This is a gutter and downspout. This is one of my favorite ones. If you've been in the seminar before, you know I like this one because they put in this piece of, I guess, corrugated siding to keep the water from dripping on the cars. It's directed directly at the steel beam and rusting the steel beam away because of and you can see here's the fireproofing. What does it look like when the steel's rusting behind? You can see the rust. Now I'm going to talk. Does anybody have any questions about the structural part? Because I was just going to take a couple minutes to tell you about the legislation changes with reserves. Chelsea, or anything else?
Yes. Yes, there are some questions. So first, should I be concerned if there are multiple railings getting loose on my high-rise balconies or just standard repairs and replacements?
Well, first of all, the railings are not part of the structural integrity inspection, although the balcony is. A lot of times the railings, they go down into the concrete, which is called a pitch pocket, and that's how they're connected. And what happens is the water gets into that pitch pocket, rusts the reinforcing, and the corner of the balcony falls out. It's a very common problem. And your railings may be loose if they're going directly into the concrete because the water's getting in there and it's loosening up the concrete so the railing can move if it's a concrete railing. If you want to, it's hard to diagnose it without seeing a picture, but if you want to send a picture, I'd be happy to take a quick look at it.
And then stick frame building with 2 walls, cement block masonry abutting against neighboring buildings, assuming inspection is needed.
I would have to, the best thing is to see a copy of the architectural or the engineering drawings to say, if it's a stick frame building, sometimes this wall you're talking about may just be a firewall and not a structural wall. You see that a lot between units in a multifamily building where it's a stick frame building. And if it's a stick frame building like townhouses with a firewall that's made out of masonry between them, it's not necessary to inspect it. As a matter of fact, the legislation says that as part of a stick building, if there are ancillary things that are made out of those materials, but they're not structural in nature holding up the building, then the building is not required to be inspected. Say a stick-built building with a steel lintel above a window. So I'd have to see it, but it sounds like it may not need to be inspected.
And then specifically regarding balconies and facades, parking garages and roofs, this is regarding a Virginia building, so not New Jersey legislation. He's a board member. He owns high-rise buildings, 15 stories and 3 garage levels. Can you please elaborate on recommended frequency of inspections for these items and the general procedures for these inspections, and general maintenance requirements and frequency? So again, this is Virginia.
Well, one thing that's left out is how old is the building?
Oh, he said 40 to 45 years.
Oh, so 40, I would inspect it right away if it's never been inspected, if it's concrete. I'd inspect it right away. And you really need to, there's so many variables. Are you doing any maintenance on the building? Have you been doing inspections? So there's so many variables, but generally when a building is 45 years old, from a structural integrity perspective, I would look at it sooner rather than later just to be safe.
And then this is a law in New Jersey. Do you anticipate it being required in Pennsylvania?
No, if it's a law in New Jersey, it's not required in Pennsylvania.
No, but will it be soon, basically, is what she's asking. Like, will it possibly be soon?
Oh, I don't know. I've learned that the legislative process, you cannot measure it in days. Let's put it that way. I don't know. I mean, this legislation in New Jersey has been in place since last January. And I will tell you that in terms of preparing the law, getting it through committees and all kinds of things to finally be voted on and put in place was about 2 years.
And then this is still structural, so I want to just touch on it here. Can you address retaining walls and what type of inspection is recommended / how often?
Well, if a retaining wall is not required to be included in a structural integrity inspection. Structural integrity inspections are only required for buildings that people live in. So if there's a retaining wall in the middle of a grass area that's collapsing or whatever condition it's in, it's not required to be inspected as part of this legislation. Keep in mind, for example, if you have a community that's built out of all concrete buildings, exactly primary load bearing system, all that kind of stuff, if it's buildings that people live in, it needs to be inspected. But if you have a clubhouse that does not have people living in it, it's not for residential use, even though it's part of that community, it does not have to be inspected as part of legislation.
And just one more. The language in the new reserve legislation allows for both repairs and replacement. Therefore, some boards are interpreting this to mean that they can budget for repairs, example roofs, as opposed to replacements, which they don't agree with, the management doesn't agree with. What is your interpretation of this?
Well, first of all, the National Reserve Study Standards, CIS standards, have always used the terminology repair or replace. It's always been like that. It's the legislation in New Jersey refers to those standards. But if it's something like a roof that you know will need to be replaced, you may repair it, which to me is not repair, it's really ongoing maintenance. A shingle blows off or something, but the roof needs to be included. I'll also tell you that if you look at the legislation for developers, and I'm going to touch on it in a second, but when it comes to reserves, the legislation in New Jersey that's been in place for a number of years, but not forever, says that developers need to include in their governing documents adequate reserves for all components with a useful life of 30 years or less, except for roofs. They need to be included irrespective of their useful life. And I'm going to touch on that in a second, why we're in a problem we're in. But if it's a roof, it will need to be replaced. It's not going to last forever. You may maintenance, if it's a 25-year roof, by doing ongoing preventive maintenance, you're probably going to get to 25 years out of it, but you're not going to get much more.
All right.
That's it?
Yep, for now.
All right.
Oh, wait, sorry, 1 second, one more. Can you overview the time frame for the structural report to be done? And when done, where does the report go and who does it?
All right. As far as how long it takes to get done, it depends on how busy the firm is. I think, you're probably not the answer you want to hear, but
yeah,
I would suggest, and Seth might be mad if I say this, but when you hire somebody to do one of these structural integrity inspections, ask them for a time frame, because make sure you know when you're going to get it, or approximately when you're going to get it. It could be affected by rain and things like that, but get a time frame. As far as where it goes, I think I mentioned the legislation is pretty clear that the engineer needs to send it to the local building official. They need to get a copy, and it needs to be accessible by unit owners, either by by going to the manager and asking to see a copy. Okay. All right, I'm going to touch on this for a couple seconds because there really has not been a huge amount of negative feedback from associations in regards to the structural integrity inspections. And let me tell you what happens. Since I was intimately involved in this thing, along with Dave and Ed, whenever a legislator gets a complaint about the legislation, that legislator, say Senator Singleton or somebody, will send it to our lobbyist, Michelle Jaker, who's awesome down in Trenton, and she'll give it to us to review and comment back to the legislator, and sometimes talk to the association about, is it being handled correctly? So I've been involved in a number of those. No charge, by the way. I've been involved in a number of those. But what's happened is the biggest problem we've run into is that associations are running into big increases in their reserves because the legislation is now requiring them to do reserve studies and to fund them for adequate reserves. And people are saying that this is caused by the legislation. It's not caused by the legislation. It's caused based on the fact that associations have not been funding adequately to keep their maintenance fees lower. And as the associations get older, you're getting closer and closer to the time when you have to replace the roofs or the roads or whatever, and they're not having enough money. So when the legislation says you need to fund it so you have enough money. And I'll touch about what adequacy means in a second, because it's been very much clarified. But this chart I'm just showing you, this is years on the bottom, and this is the reserve fund, how much you have in the reserve fund. The vertical red line is the point of turnover. Developers in control to the left, the association takes control to the right. So what happens is when the developers in control start at the bottom, they are required to have adequate reserve funding and to fund it. So what happens is while they're in control, they're collecting the money. I have to take a little asterisk to that. As part of the new legislation, the developers not only required to have adequate reserves and fund them, but the developers also required to do a preventive maintenance plan and to fund it in the operating budget, which is brand new as part of this legislation for developers. But what has happened historically is the association now takes control. If they continue funding it adequately, they continue on this gray line. They keep on going up. When they replace something, they don't go below zero. They don't have a deficit. What a lot of associations have done is that they don't fund it adequately because of maintenance fees or whatever reason. So they collect less than they should have. Then they get to the point where they need to replace something and they go into a deficit. This is what caused the big problem in the state of New Jersey and other places, that people are not adequately funding their reserves. The legislation says that the association, every association, needs to have a reserve study, needs to put it together for adequate funding, which I'm going to talk about in a second, and fund it to make sure it's adequate. So what's happened is, this is what the definition that's been clarified. There's a new bill out there right now that was just passed and voted on through, I guess, assembly or whatever you call it, just yesterday. And now it has to go through committee and then come back for a final vote. But it's the reason that this bill has been changed is because so many people have complained about the fact that they have big jumps in their funding and based on legislation. So here's the definition of adequacy. Adequacy means essentially that when you have a 30-year funding plan, which are required, that over that 30-year funding plan, you cannot drop below zero. That's the definition of adequacy. What's also happened, there are a number of engineering firms, and I'm not going to name them, but I know who they are, who do not provide a study that shows that it goes down to zero, which is also known as baseline funding. They don't show it. They say it's too risky and they won't show it, which makes it even worse. The new legislation says, and even if boards ask for it, they won't show it. The legislation says that the reserve study that's prepared as part of the legislation must include a study that shows what the funding requirement is if it drops down to zero, or what's known as a baseline funding plan. The legislation says that it has to show that now. It doesn't mean that the board can't go with a different funding plan, but because some engineers refuse to show it, and that's how you define adequacy, not going below zero, the legislation says they now have to include it. So they have to do that as part of the reserve study now. It says they, pursuant to section, will not fall set forth in the association's 30-year funding plan prepared by as part of the reserve study, regardless of whether the reserve study was conducted. All right, that's time payments. So I talk about in a second, but they have to include the baseline funding within the reserve study. That's new. What else does it say? That here's I got the wrong page. It says which shall include a 30-year funding plan, brings it down to zero. So here's what the cash flow looks like: goes into the future, drops down to zero, and then goes up again. That's also known as baseline funding, but the reserve studies now need to include that. All right, what else does it say? All right, you ready for this? We really got, it says that the association can set up there's a couple of options. They shall either fund the capital reserve fund in accordance with one of the funding plans set forth in a reserve study, which is, and not to go into a lot of detail unless you have questions, baseline funding, threshold funding, full funding. They have to fund in accordance with one of those, or fund the capital reserve in an amount equal to 85% of the funding plans. So if they're doing a baseline funding and let it go down to zero, legislation now says that you can use 85% funding, which means you will have a deficit. It's allowing you to do that only for 5 years, so you can have a catch-up period. But it says you can fund the reserve amount in an amount equal to 85% of one of the capital reserve funding plans. So you can take baseline funding, fund it 85% for 5 years. That's it. But that gives them a chance to catch up. It's really, I mean, maybe I shouldn't say, but it's really pushing the can down the road a little for that 15%. It also says that if the association decides to go with the 85% funding option, there has to be, here it is, reserve component. This is just from yesterday, the words. The association shall provide notice to all unit owners of the association in 20-point bold font, which specifies that the executive board has elected to fund the reserve fund at 85%, of the plan recommended in the 30-year in the reserve study. And it has to provide in that notice to the unit owners the years that it's going to happen and what the special assessment that's anticipated to happen is. It also says that if somebody's prior a contract of a purchase of a residential unit, the seller shall provide the buyer a copy of this notification talking about a special assessment. The reason this was added is because there was so much pushback because people are having jumps in their funding that it's coming. And as you know, this, well, I know that it's based on votes. So we were asked, can we come up with some kind of plan to allow this to happen, to do something? Also keep in mind that the legislation now says that if you continue to use your existing reserve study and it affects the prior year budget by more or less than 10% a jump in the prior year's budget, if it's less than 10%, then you have 2 years to make up a shortfall. If it's more than 10%, you have 10 years. That wording's been taken out. It's gone. So forget about the 5 and 10%. The reserve studies, you can fund deficits over a full projection period of 30 years. And I can go into detail what you mean. But here now it says that this 85% model can't be used by the association for more than 5 fiscal years. So then it's only 5 fiscal years, but keep in mind, the legislation says reserve studies have to be updated every 5 years anyway. So that's in there. But this is brand new stuff. It has not been approved yet. It's hot off the presses. And this is what, if it's passed, it's going to say. It's going to be more clarification stuff. And now, you like this picture? Like, if you're not going to believe this, but this picture, I asked ChatGPT to give me a humorous graphic of somebody looking at structural integrity inspection in a parking garage. And ChatGPT did this for me. So I'm going to stop the share now. Look at all your faces. Out of 140, we have 67 people here, about half. But if anybody has any questions, now is a good time to jump in. You can see I'm pretty involved in this stuff. So feel free to ask me anything, voice or like chat, whatever you'd like to do. Anybody have any questions? No? Chelsea, am I missing anything?
Mitch,
No, there was a
Mitch, am I
question in the
allowed to
beginning.
ask a question?
Yeah, of course. That's Brandon from Kipcon.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brandon. I'm the reserve study manager at Kipcon, for those that don't know.
And you should know the
So
answer.
that last few slides there is very interesting to me. So I know it's not implemented yet, but is there any kind of time frame for something like that we should be looking out for?
Well, like I said before, the legislative process takes time. This now has to go back to committee. Like I testified in front of the housing committee a few weeks ago, so who knows, but it's going to go back to committee. And then I'm guessing that it might move relatively quickly only because of the pushback that the legislators are getting in terms of these jumps in reserve funding. And Brandon can tell you that out of all the reserve studies Kipcon does, which is a lot, especially since legislation, what percentage of them are inadequately funded when you get them?
About 98%, if not more.
58%. Does that tell you something? It tells you either the associations have not been updating them or they've been updating them and not following what the reserve studies show. Keep in mind, now you have to update them every 5 years and you have to fund based on what it says to maintain adequate funding. So 98%. And I've done like a poll of the other guys that are on this National Task Force on Reserves, Robert Norman from California, a few of them, I've asked them, they come back with the same answer. When they do updates, 90% plus of them are underfunded all across the country or not adequately funding, which means that at some point in that 30-year projection, it's going to run into a deficit.
I have a question. I do. Hello?
Okay.
Mitch?
Oh, David?
Yes. Okay, here's my question. One, who is checking to see if they're adequately funded? In other words, what's the teeth behind this legislation and what are the consequences of not adequately funding? Who's policing this?
That's a great question. By the way, if anybody needs a loan for any capital improvement projects or corrective maintenance, just call David. He has very low interest rates. I think 2%, 30-year fixed. No.
Oh, sure.
No,
Lower.
So, but it's a great question because the DCA is not, the DCA is not monitoring this. Because, they're not monitoring it. It's really, don't laugh when I say it, but it's kind of self-monitoring, that when you have your accountant doing your annual audits, whatever they do, it's going to be disclosed in there whether or not you're funding in conformance with the reserve study. And is Mohammed here today? Because he usually jumps in on this.
I didn't see him.
But it's self-monitoring. It's being disclosed in your financials each year. Your management company is monitoring it. There's all kinds of risks involved if you don't do it. And there's also what I think may happen at some point, because I'm actually an expert in one of them already, that the homeowners are going to, in the future, may sue a prior board for a special assessment because they didn't fund properly. But there's nobody watching over your shoulder. Great question.
Mitch,
And
Mitch,
let me
it's
ask you a question, David. If you have an association that doesn't fund what the reserve study says, and you've seen the projection of deficit, are they going to get a loan from you?
The answer is it's a credit criteria. So what happens is we look at if they're coming to us for a $2 million loan, say, and their reserve study says they need another 8 million over the next 10 years. That will be our credit criteria. So we're just not looking at the 2 million. We're also looking for their ability to fund 10 million in repair and restoration over a period of time. So we're looking, it can affect our ability to loan if they're extremely underfunded for future projects.
Okay, also keep in mind the famous Fannie and Freddie word. Many loans for refinance and new purchases are based on Fannie and Freddie loans, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They have specific reserve funding requirements, which is 10% of the annual budget based on a reserve study. It's not more than 2 years old, these kind of things. But their requirements also say their loan are based on, are you meeting statutory requirements if there are any?
Can I jump in on that? Because
Yes,
this is a common misconception. When associations come to Fannie and Freddie, just to give everybody an idea, those are acronyms for government agencies that buy the majority of mortgages in the United States. If an association comes to a bank for an association loan, the bank is not generally concerned if they're approved by Freddie or Fannie Mae, if they're FHA approved. If an individual is going out to get a mortgage for their unit, and the bank sees that the association is not FHA approved, the bank for the individual mortgage may not want to lend money because they cannot sell that mortgage to FHA.
Yeah, that's a great point because
So
the
it's a common
decision is made by the lender.
And Mitch, it's Dean.
Yeah, because the lender wants to get rid of the mortgage. They want to sell the mortgage off. They don't want to keep it. So if it's not an FHA approved association, they're not going, your local bank is not going to be able to get rid of the mortgage. So they won't offer you a mortgage for the individual unit.
Right? Did I hear Dean? Was Dean?
Yeah, Mitch, can you hear me? I just wanted to add, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal about a week or so ago that also talked about this so-called blacklist with respect to Fannie and Freddie that even discussed this specific points that are, as David said, related to individual homeowner buyers. But that is where I think the biggest issue is that it's being looked at very closely by some of the, mortgage companies that are providing loans to individual home buyers. So just an interesting point. There's an article that's out there that the Wall Street Journal published in this respect fairly recently.
Yep.
And also that Fannie and Freddie have that addendum form to fill out. And I think the first question says, when is the last time you had an engineer or an inspection done? It doesn't say you have to have an inspection done. It just says, when's the last time you had one done? Just say I haven't. Because then they look at board meeting minutes, all kinds of stuff the lenders do. So whole other topic that probably could talk about for an hour.
I just have one more comment. I don't mean to take too much airtime, but I had put this in the chat before. This is something banks never looked at, I would say even 5 years ago, but we're requiring an engineer to certify structural integrity. So it makes it a lot easier in New Jersey if it's in the reserve study. In New York City, they're much more lackadaisical. They'll never put that into law.
Well, in New York, they don't do reserve studies there.
Yeah, their attitude is pay as it comes. It'll never be in there. So it's a real hindrance to get an engineer to bring them in and pay them whatever it costs to do to certify a building is structurally sound. But we, depending on the age of the building, we may bypass an approval if we can't get it.
And it's very interesting in New York and other cities, they have facade inspection laws. So you have to inspect the facade to make sure nothing.
Local 11.
Make sure nothing falls on the people walking by, but there's nothing requirement to inspect the structure and make sure it doesn't fall on the people that live there. So it's interesting. Anything else?
We do have another question on the chat regarding reserve studies. How does an RS decide on what level of funding is required, methodology, how much variability between all different companies who offer reserve studies in New Jersey?
Maybe I'll let Brandon, if he wants to touch on how Kipcon does that. But
leave this now.
Sorry? But I will tell you that I've seen through this legislation prior to, I've seen just about every firm's reserve studies. And, some are easier to read, some are harder to read. But to me, and I'll let Brandon respond to it, I think you need to have a conversation with the reserve provider. If you don't have a conversation with the reserve provider to get you where you need to go, I think you're making a mistake. But Brandon, am I right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in our report specifically at Kipcon, we show full funding, baseline funding, current funding, and then some sort of threshold. There's a million different ways you can have a threshold funding method, but those are the four we show as a baseline. As far as which you should select, it really depends. Like Mitch said, for a newer community, you might be able to be a little bit more liberal with things, but every community is different. We get asked that all the time. Well, what should we do? You really don't know until you see the numbers and you see the situation that you're in. So definitely an open line of communication with us, the engineer, you guys, the board and the management is definitely key. We're happy to meet via Zoom or, answer any questions that you have after the report is issued. But yeah, I mean, like Mitch said, long story short, it's all about communication and, we want to make sure that we're giving you a document that's real, while yes, there are legs of the legislation that need to be met, we want to also be realistic as far as your needs go and what your homeowners can do. So we're happy to work with you on a funding scenario that works for all.
And one thing I have to mention is that, and the legislation has been clarified to say this, is that a lot of reserve providers have said you're setting aside $100,000 a year. In order to be adequately funded, you need to jump to $200,000 a year, which has caused a huge panic. The legislation has clarified it, and it actually was allowed before that if you're setting aside 100 now, you don't have to jump to 200,000. It's 10% a year, as long as it doesn't go below zero over that 30-year plan. But you don't have to do the jump if you can get it funded adequately in a different way by phasing it up. And it says in the legislation now that you can incrementally increase your reserves rather than having to jump, even though it was the intent before.
Mitch, I have to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure. I'll see you in 10 years.
And Chelsea, if you could email that presentation, I really would appreciate it.
Absolutely. I'm going to send a copy of the presentation to everyone. Email me specifically for your certificate. I've been sending out a few already, but thank you all for hanging in there and joining us this morning. We still have almost 60 people that stayed all the way to the end. So,
and if anybody ever would want a presentation similar to this given to your management company or to all your boards or something, we do that all the time. So all you have to do is ask. Any other questions? I see a bunch of faces there that have questions, but they're not asking. Sam, you have something to say. I know. No? All right.
Why is Pennsylvania not following New Jersey's requirements?
Well, it's a statutory requirement by state, and I think that New Jersey has really been very proactive in this because after what happened in Florida, I think New Jersey is the first state that came out with structural legislation after Florida. And there's, like I said, there's some in Delaware now, but as far as the reserve funding, if you look at the CAI national website, there are a lot of states right now that are moving towards reserve legislation. The other thing to keep in mind is a person who does a reserve study most of the time is not qualified to do structural integrity inspection. A reserve specialist does not need to be an engineer, does not need to be a structural engineer, and you should never expect that the reserve specialist who's going out to do reserve study will be looking at the structure also. The structure is typically not included in the reserve study, and it's totally different qualifications.
So if we have a reserve study, do we have to contract with your firm to do an independent structural study also?
Yes, absolutely. It's two different animals totally. And for example, I don't know if Seth is still here, but he could touch on a lot of the associations that Kipcon's doing the structural integrity for is also doing the reserve study, because I know that I've been involved in a number of structural engineering, structural integrity inspections, and I always talk to the reserve provider to make sure any corrective maintenance is included in the reserve study. And also the legislation says that the reserve study has to include the cost of the update of the study now. And if it's a community that does a structural engineer integrity inspection, it needs to include the cost of that next structural integrity inspection and the timing. So
I see. It appears that board of directors of HOAs are non-technical individuals for the most part. They're just volunteers, and they probably don't necessarily understand this entire process. Is there a learning process that the board should be spoken to prior to the beginning of an inspection?
You're at one right now. So, but it's a totally different, you're right. It depends on the management company. Most managers, I see somebody from Taylor sitting here. I saw somebody from First Service. I know, for example, Taylor has had me in to give 10 webinars to their people about structural integrity inspections, reserve studies, and this whole thing. And Bruce Noel and I become great buddies over this stuff. But talk to your manager. I happen to see a Taylor sign there, which is the reason I'm saying it. But most management companies are having somebody come in to give seminars on this to both themselves and their boards, so that they're educated on this stuff, because it's a whole new world, and it should have happened 30 years ago, and it happened now, and people that, I hate to say, that had to be based on tragedy.
Very good. Thank you very much for this presentation.
Oh, you're welcome.
One more question while Chris is still hanging on there. He asked to discuss the evaluation of a community's private sewer collection system that is all underground, over 20 years old.
That's a great question. From a reserve study perspective, the national standards have been changed to say that, well, it used to say that the components on the reserve studies are things you can see. Now it's very clear, if there are common elements that will require replacement that you can't see, they should somehow be included in the reserve study. So if you have underground piping that is going to require replacement for whatever reason, historically, you know that it's falling apart, somehow it should be included in the reserve study. When I was working at Kipcon, what we used to do is take up on a high-rise building, for example, take a percentage of the total replacement cost and say that percentage is for unseen components that will require replacement. But there are different ways to do it, but the standards are very clear. Two things. First of all, that things you can't see should be included. The other big change is that it used to be that the general rule of thumb is it only includes components with a useful life of 30 years or less from the date of the study being done. Now there's a term called a long life component, where anything that has a useful life as far out as you can go should be included on the reserve study and either funded or listed that they need to be added at a future date. And that's new to the standards also. Anything else? Michelle? No? Nick? Noel?
Well, I do have a question if you have a moment.
Of course.
So we've had our balconies and our facades repaired in 2009. Our reserve study said we should do another inspection and a repair in 19. That did not get done because of other expenditures going on. And we're now trying to catch up with that. The question which has come up is how should that inspection be done? Can this be done as a visual inspection, or do we need to? We have both railings and enclosures bolted into our concrete balconies, and our concern is that those are, of course, weak leak lines into the rebar on the balconies. Do we need to do sounding on the balconies? How do we inspect that concrete? That's a current discussion within the board.
Yeah, it's a good question. And that, generally it starts with a visual observation, and generally a structural engineer can tell whether or not you should do additional like soundings or things like that, just based on what they see visually. So I always start with a visual. I mean, there's no question you could jump right into doing other stuff, but you may not need it. Are they
Okay.
bolted in or are they pitch pockets?
They're bolted in.
Yeah, bolted in makes a big difference because the pitch pockets are huge problems. And I would ask what town you're in, because in New Jersey, there are certain towns now that require structural integrity inspections and facade inspections.
We're in Virginia and we don't have those requirements. As a matter of fact, the law is we're well ahead of the law in doing both our reserve studies and our structural inspections, but we did get crossed up with Fannie Mae for a while, and then we got off their bad boy list. But I viewed being put on the bad boy list as a shot across the bow.
Oh, yeah. By the way, along those lines, there's CAI National is having a webinar that I'm putting together. That's the first for Thursday and Friday of April, the M320 class on high rises. And we have a great panel of speakers. If you go to CAI National's website and take a look at it, it's over 2 afternoons. It's Thursday and Friday from 12 to 3. And we have a huge, great group of presenters over those 2 days. But that's a for-pay webinar given by CAI National. It's the M320 class, and it's next week. So if anybody wants to participate, go to the website. I think we usually have about 40 to 50 people from across the country. It's all high-rise related. It's a high level. It's a 300 level class. So, sometimes you learn, well, all the time, you learn a lot more from the participants sometimes than the actual instructors, because they've all been doing this for many years, but it's all high-rise if you're interested.
And then Mitch, just to close the loop on the sewer question, how does a collection system get inspected, and what is the estimated cost for the evaluation?
The cost would be hard to sell, but sometimes you'll actually TV those lines if you're having problems where there are companies that will put TV cameras through the storm sewer, and you can see if the pipes are cracked or broken or what's going on. And we've been involved in another number of communities where actually will TV the storm sewer lines, or not only storm sewer lines, but underground piping. My experience has been the TVing is not really that expensive. Anything else? Mark and Chuck, are you going to correct me at all about anything? No? Mark is in, if you have any questions about the structural integrity inspections at Kipcon, Mark is a licensed engineer and a licensed architect, and he heads up all the structural integrity inspections that Kipcon does. He reviews every one of them. So if there's anything wrong with anything, call Mark at home. Anything else? We went way over. I appreciate that. I think there's 40 people that are staying on.
I have a question for you, Mitch. It's Diana Janos. I manage Carlton Tower here in Passaic, and Kipcon has done our reserve studies and our paper update study recently. The association board was actually sitting in a seminar at one of the expos, and we heard about the upcoming 2760. And of course, we panicked because our reserve study was not funded appropriately. So the board was proactive and did obtain a multi-million-dollar loan from Popular Bank to perform the majority of the reserve study items and several capital improvements. So we wanted to wait until after all of those were done to have a structural assessment done and an updated reserve study. What is your time frame from the point of signing the agreement to do those two studies, the study structural and reserve? from the time an agreement would be signed to the completion date. So we would come in under the guideline or the timeline for the requirement.
Well, I'm going to put Mark on the spot with that because he schedules all these, but I will also tell you, you mentioned a reserve study update. The updates based on the regulations do not allow paper updates. They have to include a site visit. So that will not pass the legislation. It's got to be an update with a site visit. As far as schedule, Mark is dying to answer that question because he's very slow right now, I'm sure.
Yeah, our paper update came after COVID when we knew that the pricing was going through the roof. So we just wanted to have a better idea of what it would cost.
Yeah, keep in mind as far as the pricing, I have to say, people sometimes I think get a little carried away with the pricing. The reserve study is a budgetary tool. It goes out 30 years. What I suggest is that if you're updating it every 5 years, the things within the first 5-year period, you should include any current inflationary impacts on them. Once you get past the 5 years, you may not even want to include interest and inflation or include it when you update the study. As soon as you include inflation in your study, it hugely skews the results. And I can show you a study where either you include it in the study or you let it take into account every time you update it. It comes out about the same in the long run. And if I'm not mistaken, Kipcon and most firms say that unless you tell us differently, we're going to include an inflationary rate and an interest rate in your study. Now that the update requirements are in a law, I'm not convinced for some associations that's the best way to do it. So talk to whoever you're doing your study for you. But as far as the schedule, Mark, you're on. You tried to escape.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Mark Dianchuk, Kipcon. So what I would advise you is to, if you know you're going to need the structural inspection and the reserve study, is to don't wait till the summer or the fall, because everybody else will be waiting too. And right now we have a backlog, and it takes a couple months to get to the inspection. So I would sign up for it, as soon as you can and get on the schedule, because I foresee a large volume of these inspections come the latter part of this year. I don't know if that helps you, but if you know you need to do it and you're just looking for timing, I would say sign up for it, and whether it's with Kipcon or another engineer, sign up as soon as you can, because you want to get on their schedule, because not just Kipcon, but I know all the other engineers are busy as well.
And Mark, I'll jump in as far as the reserve leg is concerned, just to give people an idea. Right now, I totally agree with Mark. Even if you don't want to do it until the fall, the best plan would be get it in our system. We can make a note and say, hey, we don't want to do it until the fall. But as far as the reserve goes right now, we're probably running in the 10 to 12 week range from when we receive a retainer to when you get a report. Obviously, we do the best we can to meet any scheduling needs and stuff that you guys have, but that's kind of our typical time frame right now.
Any other questions? No, we're going to be sending out a copy of this presentation. We're going to send out a copy of the public policy on condominium safety, a copy of, what else did we say? The best practice report on maintenance,
Mhm.
the new updated reserve study standards. Chelsea, are you sending anything else, or we have got
The recording and the copy of the presentation, as you said, and certificates to anybody that reaches out. And I'm going to send it to everybody who participated. So if you need my email, you'll get it regardless. If you want to wait till then to ask for your certificate.
And if anybody has any other topics that you can think of that you'd like Kipcon to do a presentation on, just let Chelsea know, because
Absolutely.
I think they're booked up for the year. She has presentations, but if there's a topic they'd like, I think I can BS about anything. So,
That's true. He'll talk about anything too.
thank you everybody for showing up today. I really appreciate it. And we still have about 40 people here, and we're into it an hour and a half. So
We appreciate you.
thank you very much. If you have any questions, email us, send us a picture. We'd be happy to take a look at it.
Yes.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.